Hello, everybody. This is Lenny Murphy. Welcome to the latest in the Green Book webinar series. And today, our topic is preparing for the coming data privacy storm, how a compliance-focused personal data network can help you, and brought to you by our friends at Veriglif. A few housekeeping tips. This will last 1 hour. You're on mute. Use the chat box to submit any questions or comments. And the recording and this deck will be available in 2 to 3 days. As I said, I'm Lenny Murphy. I'm the editor-in-chief of Green Book. Full disclosure, I am also a shareholder and a director in Veriglif. So where normally I would function as the MC, today I will be an active participant in the presentation. And I'm joined by two of my colleagues, James Wilson. James, introduce yourself.
Yes, hello everybody. I'm James Wilson. I've been a little bit about myself. I've been in the IT industry for over 20 years, and specifically in the market research space within the IT industry for over 10 years. So, formerly the CTO of Potentiate, and been involved in about 5 startups, and now the CEO of Veriglif. So, I'm glad to be here.
Thank you, James. And the man, the myth, the legend, Rolf Swinton. Rolf.
Hey, Lenny, thanks for that. Yeah, I'm Rolf Swinton. I'm currently have the pleasure of working with GFK, where I'm responsible for data assets. And I've been an entrepreneur for a long time, building data collection companies, and I've always been a really big believer in how do you put consumer privacy first, because after all, it's all our data collectively, right, that people are taking and using. And I've always felt really strongly about how do we always try to create tools and products to really serve the interests of each of us, and not let certain players like, take some of the guys in the news like Equifax and that, who are not having to take much of a punishment for really abusing the use of our data. And so happy to dig into this topic with everyone today.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. So we're going to jump in. So the data privacy storm is upon us. The logos here are GDPR, and then also the California Office of the Attorney General with their new privacy component. And here's kind of our take on the environment. GDPR launched in May of 2018 with a whole new framework for ownership rights and transparency. CCPA, which is the California Consumer Protection, I forget what the A stands for. Anyway. It goes into effect in January. Thank you, James. And it puts massive limits on selling PII to others and clarity on use of data. But those are 2 laws. It's a very fragmented data ecosystem. There's no single connective network to manage compliance for all stakeholders kind of across all of the different legislative environments. What we anticipate on the Veriglif side is a solution to that issue, and we think the transparency to comply with future legislation so that consumers know who's using their data and are compensated for it will be kind of the defining characteristic as things roll out. And we'll talk about how we view what we can do to help that later on. But first, let's look a little more at these laws. So there's 3 big ones that are in effect. GDPR, which we've talked about, the CCPA. There's also one in Brazil that's very similar called LGPD. And, overall, now we've seen 117 different omnibus laws, another 28 sectoral laws come into play. There's more amendments coming for CCPA and LGDP. There's really no end in sight to countries and regions bringing their own legislation into effect over the coming months. For instance, CCPA does not apply to all businesses, only those revenue above 25 million or with more than 50,000 household consumer device records. But there's lots of variability across the board in all of these laws that are coming into play. If we look at it, globally, Forrester recently released a study. This is just an immensely fragmented and complex framework of different laws, different countries, different states, all having radically different perspectives on the legal framework for how to handle data privacy. And it's only going to become more complex, even if we just look in the United States alone. there are lots of states with different laws that are in various stages of being enacted. We've got California, Oregon, those are being rolled out, Pennsylvania, New York. There's laws in Maine, in Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, and none of them are exactly the same. What they're all inspired by, to an extent, is GDPR, but they have different flavors and permutations. But what they really have in common is the right of the data subject. And if we kind of condense that down, it's around gaining consent in clear, understandable language, giving consumers the ability to access their personal data, to understand why it's being used and who's using it, the right to have inaccurate personal data corrected, the right to be forgotten. That's a big deal. So anyone who is involved in handling that data, whether in the world of the research, let's say a panelist, or a panel provider, or a data collection company, or the end client, these laws all force those individual stakeholders to erase the personal data in certain circumstances. The right for data portability, to get it, to be able to utilize it themselves and get that in an easy to manage way, and a right not to be subject to a decision based solely on automated processing, including profiling, which produces legal effects concerning him or her similarly significantly affects the data subjects. Now, one example of that would be, let's say, credit decisions. But as the world of marketing and research combine, it could be an issue of not getting an opportunity or an ad because they've been profiled incorrectly, right? And there's been conversations that I've seen occurring in multiple high levels with brands that the idea of the level of targeting that we can achieve from a data standpoint may actually create legal complications because we're targeting too well and denying populations opportunities for discounts, for instance. So this is something that really does affect the research industry, not just kind of the broader data industry. James or Rolf, would you add anything to that, kind of the broad overview?
Yeah, I think so. I think the two big commonalities between all of the legislation that's coming abroad and is really, obviously giving the individual right around how their data is used. But it's also, the biggest one is the transparency. It makes sense that we know how our data is being used. Now, the reality is not many people will probably go in and actually find out how their data is being used. But having that right to know that, well, anytime I can, is a big deal. It's one of the things that you'd like to know that it's there, whether you use it or not. But so yeah, that's probably the most common theme amongst all the legislation.
Yeah. Rolf, anything else you'd add?
No, I think you guys it's good.
Okay. All right. So now we're going to dive into some details on these next slides. Now, I mentioned before that you're going to get a copy of this deck. So we designed this as a leave behind. So I'm not going to cover every single point on each of these. This is actually was designed as a reference for you after the fact. So keep that in mind. But let's talk about GDPR for a minute. The core is that EU user data belongs to the EU user, not the person who collected it. That is a bedrock principle that is being applied across the board here. It doesn't matter that you have a relationship with the panelist or you have a relationship with the customer. Now, it's their data, not yours. They are granting you an ability to utilize it, and that comes with certain conditions. For GDPR specifically, we need to rethink the idea of what is PII. So any information related to an identified or identifiable person, a data subject, is PII. That includes images, pictures, video, right? Their face. It's a massively complex set of controls put in place that identify what this may be. It could be HR data or the consumer data on purchases, business contact information, website visitors data, IT network traffic, anything that's potentially identifiable, even if it's collected from publicly available sources, is personal data. That is a GDPR perspective. And since every other law is coming after GDPR, they're influenced by those definitions. there is one section of GDPR focused on particularly sensitive data, and their position is that there has to be a legitimate or lawful reason for collecting, storing, transmitting, or processing this data. Now, race and ethnic origin, religious, philosophical beliefs, political opinions, trade union memberships, biometric data used to identify an individual, genetic data, health data, data related to sexual preferences, sex life, or sexual orientation. A lot of this stuff, these are questions that we would routinely ask in a variety of different research settings. So, there are potentially significant issues for the research industry, and particularly in public polling, on GDPR compliance. And the real challenge is as we get into this is, as James mentioned, is traceability and transparency and permissioning. That's been the collective concern across the board as we move into this new world. Is GDPR being enforced? Yep. So since it was rolled out, there has been over 1,000 data protection complaints just in the UK. In Ireland, there were 386. There are 547 breach notifications. Czech Republic and France, 400. Yes, the people are complaining, and there are enforcement actions being put in place. And if we just think again from, go ahead, James.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just going to say, that's an interesting stat, showing how many people are actually complaining and using that new right. We would have had no idea before this legislation came into force as to how many people actually, were that concerned about it. And what we see is, there are a number of people who are concerned. And so, it's one of the things that's hard to quantify before it's actually in effect.
Yep. And, bear in mind, even with that, with the consumers, that's a relatively small number, of course, if you look at total ER or EU population. But each occurrence has major financial implications. So, Facebook, they were going after them. They were fined $645,000 for Cambridge Analytica. Google was fined $57 million in France. There's a social media company in Germany that was fined $22,000. They're taking this stuff seriously. There's even an example in Austria that an entrepreneur is fined for placing a CCT system outside his establishment because it wasn't sufficiently marked because it was recording people's images. So, this is ramping up as a significant risk factor for everybody involved in the entire ecosystem. And it's something we need to be cognizant of. Now we have CCPA going into effect in California. It started in 2018. It goes in effect in January 1st. It's enforceable July 1st. It's very much like GDPR, but it's broader. The law is broader. Now, right now, it only applies to California residents and businesses, but from a research standpoint, what's the last study you did, particularly if we're looking at random sample for a population that didn't include California, right? Mm-hmm. So it's very challenging to think about that. Compliance must be enforced, and they're going to be enforced around companies that have gross revenue greater than 25 million, collects info from more than 50,000 consumers, households, or devices, or 50% of their annual revenue from consumer data sales. That's pretty much every panel company that exists. For instance, they don't have to be housed in California. They're doing business in California. So, it's a significant issue. Their definition of consumer personal information is pretty broad. It's anything that identifies, relates to, describes, is capable of being associated with, or could reasonably be linked directly or indirectly with a particular consumer or household. Name, address, geolocation, any online identifiers, health information, income, cultural profile, more. Think about the type of information that we as an industry in research collect, or the information that is collected via ad tech or martech. And we collect this data every single day. Our industry is driven buy this type of information, and we're not going to have to really pay attention to it. Go ahead.
I was going to say one of the things that's been introduced with CCPA is as well is this concept of a household, which makes sense. So GDPR talks about an individual or a subject. CCPA introduces a household. I mean, there are the computers in my household that are shared by my kids across them. So it would be impossible to narrow it down to one particular individual around that person's rights. And so that's probably why they've introduced this concept, because there are shared devices and shared data amongst a household. Yep.
And that's a good point. This with household now, it affects everybody in the household, including children. So, so if you violate CCPA, this is being governed by the Attorney General. It's $100 or $750 per consumer per incident for failure to implement and maintain reasonable security procedures. Reasonable is not defined. It's $2,500 for each violation or $7,500 for each intentional violation. And the Attorney General will rule if a violation is applied to consumer per day or something else. Again, if we're looking at from a sample standpoint, that we do a survey that includes 500 respondents across California, which certainly could be reasonable, that could add up really quickly from a compliance standpoint. The good thing is that it's really kicked off a national privacy debate. So there's a lot of effort right now to even amend CCPA to make it become the standard for the rest of the state or for the rest of the country. There's more than 55 different bills competing for attention around this. We think that the amendments that are being debated are related to the definition of consumers, personal information, fraud detection, data brokers. There's some challenges because it may conflict with the Fair Credit Reporting Act and the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, so those things will have to be worked out federally. We don't see federal action in sight right this minute, but there's certainly things that are in play, and as we would expect as we head into 2020, we think this will, in the election year, this will become a bigger issue during the election, and would anticipate there being some action that will come into play. There is general agreement that there needs to be a federal law. Go ahead.
Just because I mean, the challenge that legislators have around this is it is really a balancing act between the rights of individuals and how their data is treated, and the ability for a business to conduct what it has been doing for many years without too much disruption. And so that's the real challenge. How do you allow businesses to continue to advertise, to do media planning, all the activities that they typically do, where they need to access this data in a way that still protects their rights? So, there's a lot of debate around the fine detail around how to implement this legislation, which is why it is a real mess across the country and across the globe.
Yeah, what we know definitively is that there's major costs here. So the ITIF did a projection on just the compliance costs based on kind of where we are today, right? A very broad, very restrictive law that looks a lot like GDPR or CCPA that is rolled out across the country. If we look at these costs, data protection officers, that's a role that will have to be put in place in most businesses, over $6 billion. Data infrastructure, over $5 billion. Data portability, $510 million. Data access, $340 million. There's impact in terms of lower consumer efficiency. Think about how programmatic advertising works today, or even programmatic sampling works today. The impact in those two areas, verging on $2 billion.
Actually, and I think that ends up becoming, next to become really a fulcrum where we're now dealing with a number of businesses who are just for a while just stopping to license their data.
Yep.
Period.
Yep.
Because they just don't know how to do this math themselves. They look at this, they're doing their own calculations, and they're coming up with crazy larger numbers.
Yep.
Especially because of the potential litigation costs.
Yeah, I mean, look at just the access to data, the restrictions of information that could be put into play for businesses that rely on those today. Not just the research, but also anything. We're 71 billion. Low rat effectiveness, 32. I mean, these are massive, massive numbers that are projected just based on where we are today. So, kind of from our perspective at Veriglif, what we wanted to tackle was this idea of how do you build a system that could be pretty much bulletproof fundamentally based on what we could tell is happening from a data privacy standpoint. So, Rolf, you want to kind of talk about those key issues that we've been trying to tackle?
Yeah, because really, if you think about those costs that Lenny was just going through, those are predicated on the world staying as it is, and that world has to change. I feel so personally motivated, not only because in all my businesses, I've cared so deeply about this. I don't understand how Experian or Equifax or the other crazy, vast number of data breaches that go on. Just the latest one is just the fact that it's like impossible even for people to get their compensation from this. Not that the compensation really goes to be fair, but it goes to really to speak to the fact that the system is just fundamentally broken. But why is it that we all are subjected to our data being on the loose and we having no control over that? And it's really about how do you start to take control, how do we start to give control back to the ecosystem? Because while there are these breaches and while there's potential, people are currently, as business owners, are afraid of the data getting out, we have to help fix that, because data is so central to our economy, obviously. But it's with these principles that we would be, how do we rethink this? And first of all, currently right now, do any of us have any idea what Facebook has on us, much less the whole Facebook ecosystem, much less that, plus completely invisible to us? We have no idea. So how do we flip this around? How do we, as individuals and as an organization, start to provide structure? Well, the key thing is, first of all, you need to have transparency. You need to know what data is there, where is it, who has access to it, how to control it. And link to that then, where does it go? How can I follow it through? How can I make sure I understand the movements, that I know wherever my data has been used, how it's being used? If you're going to make a system work around that, though, of course, you're going to need to allow the control of that and make sure it can happen in a very thorough way at a micro level, but also allow that to be done in a way which can be scaled. Because if I, as an individual or an organization, will be able to control data assets or data elements, I know there are going to be different rules for different situations, but I need to make sure that I can scale. Because obviously, if you think about the gargantuan number of transactions happening now, to manage those two things at the same time, about both being able to control it finitely, but also allow it to work across the digital ecosystem today, it's going to take a different way of thinking about it. And we're all going to have to get compensated for this, right? At the heart of it, right now, we're getting compensated theoretically from Facebook by them providing us their service. Is that equitable? We could all have a debate about that. But for an ecosystem like what Veriglif's looking to build, how you start to prepare for really allowing the frictionless economy you need around data, you got to be able to allow people to get paid for the use of data no matter what. And again, the foundationing principle, which GDPR is really tested, is this thing about being forgettable. And ultimately, why shouldn't we have that control? Why should we not be able to, if we just decide we no longer want to play in the data ecosystem, be able to pull out? That really is the key part. So I think these pillars are incredibly important. Frankly, I think they should be, in a way, rights for us as individuals in our modern society. But these are the touchstones for how the Veriglif team has gone about approaching to solve this problem. So it really comes down to a handful of things, and I think it's important that this was Lenny and myself have been talking about this concept for easily a decade. Lenny and I even went off to go try to raise money for an idea called the Universal Privacy Register. It was an idea ahead of its time, and this is important because what made Veriglif suddenly become possible is the incredible development in blockchain technology. And this business isn't it's not a cryptocurrency play or anything. It's really about using blockchain in its purest technological advanced way, which is it allows you to securely keep a registry of transactions. If you want to if we go back to those principles and think about how do you ensure you have transparency and traceability and micro-permissioning, make it scalable and allow people to get paid. Blockchain has been the advance which can underpin this, which allows that to become possible. And so what Veriglif is able to do is really make the system a compliant data management, data permissioning system work. And so all the data can be logged, it can be, transactions around it can be managed, controlled. The permissions work through this wonderful innovation of smart contracts. And for those of you listening, if you're not familiar with these concepts, we'll be happy to go and do a deeper dive on these things. And really it's about allowing anyone to participate, whether you're a large aggregator of data or an individual participant, just wanting to be able to ultimately keep safe the data on your phone or in your increasingly smart car or whatever. There's value to being able to share your data. You get value from using your phone every day. You get value from driving your increasingly smart connected car every day. But to be able to control that, to be able to manage that is really the underpinnings of the system.
And let me jump in for a second before we hand over to James. So this is the part where you're going to think, all right, now you're pitching to us. But I want to make one thing really clear. There's nothing to pitch because Veriglif doesn't cost anything. There is a transactional processing fee for processing data on the network. That's it. So our focus has been trying to develop a system, a solution that would address two issues. One, this compliance component that we've just been talking about, right? This massive change in legislation and regulatory environment that is forcing us to think about how we utilize data in a radically different way, and has teeth to it, right? There are consequences if we are not if we're not complying with this. So our focus was, from supporters of the research industry, how do we create a framework to enable that compliance to happen? And then secondly, because we live in a world that is driven by data, then how do we also use that system to create and unlock data liquidity? And we made the decisions early on that, yes, there is a business here that's being built, but that business looks more like the fleet network or Visa transactional processing than anything else. So as James is going to go through the rest of this, he's going to talk to you about how this works, how the system works to address these issues we've just been talking about. But please don't think that there is a pitch component here, because there's not. This is an educational session so that you can understand at least one approach that's being built to address these issues. James, I'm going to shut up now.
Yeah. Thanks, mate. So I think, yeah, look, part of our DNA, part of our original concept was to make sure that this ecosystem that we are building is inclusive. We're not about destroying the relationships that exist between all of the existing parties at the moment. We are not about creating a direct relationship with the consumer, and it's about working within the existing ecosystem and improve what is already there. I mean, there's a great history of how how our industry has been operated that we don't want to disrupt, but rather we're trying to improve it with some technology that will bring some innovation and improvements in efficiencies. And particularly, as we've mentioned, one area that's getting a lot of traction right now is using our network specifically around the compliance layer. And so there's lots of features to Veriglif, and certainly today's focus is on compliance. But I want to talk a little bit about, and I'll get onto that in the next slides, about how we do that, how we put data into the system, and how we treat it. But first of all, it's just this slide is really a testament to how we want to consider all the existing stakeholders, everyone from the data collector to the consumers to the actual buyers. There has to be a benefit for each of them, and it cannot be a total disruption efficiently. And so, for example, for the research buyers using our network, they get the added advantage of validated data. So all the data that's been pushed into our system, we will generate what we call a confidence score. So it will tell you how confident we are that the record is a good match. You'll hear a lot about quality across the industry, and certainly that's a topic for another day, but we do introduce some measures that allow them to mitigate some of those risks. From a sample provider, there is a lot of usage around using our network to go out and aggregate and get more data on an individual. So if you've, say you've just onboarded a particular individual, you can use our network to go out and find more information. And it's more opportunity for you to actually sell that data that you actually have. And so what will happen with a network like ours is that rather than paying consumers just for their time to complete a survey. It will switch over time to paying them for their data. So that survey that's collected a whole bunch of rich data can be sold multiple times in our network. And so, the consumer is happy in our network because obviously they get a lot of more transparency, and it's white label transparency. So just to be clear, all of the controls that we're talking about that the end user has is white labeled through an API, through our partners. They have no direct connection to our system. But they get the added advantage of, surveys will go down, and there'll be some research that'll be done without even needing to do a survey. The data is already in the network. We've linked it up across all the various suppliers, and so you can just use what's already there. That's a common complaint amongst consumers, is that you're asking me the same question again and again and again. The survey length is too long, and the incentive is not great enough. And so we combat those by where you can reuse the data. That will cause obviously the survey length to go down, and the incentives will go up as the data has been sold multiple times. And so we think that we've captured the right balance between making sure that everybody in the existing ecosystem benefits. So how do we do it? There's probably 4 ways that we can summarize of how the network works. The very first one is, as I mentioned, we validate an identity. We do that, and steps 1 and 2 here are very related. So step 2, when I talk about linking data, what we are basically doing is all of our partners will register the minimum amount of information on a consumer that is needed. It is hash encrypted and put into our system, and that allows us to use those identifiable points to show that one record or one individual is the same individual across multiple sources. So that one individual might be across 10 different sources. One source might have the behavioral data, another might have some demographics, another might have some some opinion data, and a little bit of each. There'll be some overlap, obviously. Our system allows those records to be linked. We don't create one big super record, but we show how the records are linked. And that is what we use as part of the validation process to say, well, if this one record is linked to 6 other records, then there's a high confidence that it is a good record. We also go out with some of our partners. So one of our partners is i360, who basically has a record on every single individual across North America. And if we find a match in their network as well, then we increase the confidence score. So they're the two features, particularly that the brands will be interested in, is getting access to this more holistic view across an individual, across lots of different sources, and ensuring that it's a valid person, it's a real person, not a bot. The last 2 parts is where you're actually able to get access to the data. So step 3 and step 4, first of all, we catalog. So once we've linked up all the records, we show what's available. All those fields we show what you have access to. And then number 4 is we allow that to be transacted on. So, and this is where particularly we use blockchain to store what transactions have happened. So if a brand has bought some data from the network, we can use that transaction that's stored immutably in our blockchain to say, to provide an auditable record that the brand can say, well, I actually have the right to use this data. I purchased it on this date, and this is the usage that I'm allowed to use it for. I'm allowed to use it for market research for 6 months, on this particular individual. And so those transactions are a really big part of how we will achieve compliance across all the legislation that exists and is coming. It's important to note as well that our network uses a specific flavor of blockchain called private blockchain. So some of the big differences are that all of the individuals, all of the organizations, that are participating in the network are identified. There's no anonymous organization, which is particularly important if you are, wanting to see, if an individual is wanting to see, well, show me all the companies who have accessed my data over the last 12 months. That's a right in CCPA to see a history of 12 months. And so that private blockchain allows them to do it. And secondly, private blockchain allows a sort of controlled transparency. So not every record is available to see, or not every transaction is available for everybody to see. Only the parties that were involved. So the data agent, if there was a panel involved, the actual brand who's bought it, and the consumer who owns the actual data. They're the parties that will be able to see the transactions. So quite a bit different from a public network, a public blockchain network. Rolf, do you want to talk about our relationship with IBM?
Yeah, sure. I think the key point here, as Veriglif has been getting rolling, an advisor, I've been certainly very keen that the faster that a business like Veriglif can start to get established with really key players is critical, and I think they've had incredible success with that. IBM is a really important partner, as many of you know. IBM is, I think, both very entrenched in how to build businesses around data, and has always taken a wider than wide approach. And similarly, we've been really trying to pioneer a lot of interesting innovation in private blockchains. Pushing one particular technology, Hyperledger Fabric, and that I think what's been really fruitful is that IBM has been finding it as valuable to work with Veriglif as likewise, as this very specific area of focus around how to apply a blockchain technology in securing consumer data and transaction is a really important process. I think that's the key takeaway.
Yeah, thanks. And I think it's worth mentioning as well, IBM's interest is obviously from a commercial side as well. They want to use the data that will be available in the Veriglif network to power their relationship with mediation. So to be able to actually power ads around, first-party opted-in data that the individual can see who's using it, and be able to make better decisions around ads. I mean, Mediation estimates that over $60 billion a year through their platform that's wasted in online ads. So they can't actually validate that it's gone to the right individual. And so, I mean, we all see it. We all get sent, ads all the time that are not relevant, and that will never completely go away. But Veriglif moves us closer to the mark of, providing a more efficient way of delivering ads. Now, some of these next slides are obviously getting into some of the detail. So most of them look like Lenny mentioned before. Some of these slides are just for a takeaway, and this is one of those. So I won't read through all of this, but basically the highlight here is that our network works on APIs. So there is an API that we connect to every single partner in the network, and then the brands or the agencies that are interacting with our network just have to use one API. So one interaction, and behind the scenes we're connected up to all of the partners. So from an efficiency standpoint, it's a lot easier for them to participate by just integrating with one connection. And it also allows those who are buying the data from the network to just see one record, even though it may come from 10 different sources, it will appear as if it's one record. Behind the scenes, when you actually go to buy that record, there might be a number of smart contracts that have been executed, but we simplify that by just providing a view to one record and showing you, okay, for this record, here are all the fields that are available, and here's what you can use it for. All of the data that's in our network is hash encrypted. We are very conscious about not making sure that we store any PII at all, and so that's one of the ways that we get around compliance and legislation as well, is there is no PII that is stored. We hash it up, and that's a big selling point as well for some of the brands that we are talking to. Sometimes it requires, particularly if you've got sensitive information or health information, it requires a lot of legal work to actually set up and start dealing with a particular vendor. And so by using our network, you can go out and say, well, have you got records on these individuals without actually sharing any PII? The system will automatically hash up the records, and you're basically saying, well, if you happen to have the same hash as me, I want to purchase the record. So you haven't actually shared any PII. The system, so on point number 5 there, the system categorizes the usage into one of 2 categories. And so by using these smart contracts that Rolf talked about, we're able to control the privacy around who can use the data, what it's going to be used for, and how much you're going to sell it for, how much you're going to be compensated for. There's a lot of controls that are created with these smart contracts. And the way smart contracts work in a blockchain is that they're almost like a for sale sign, right? So there's a contract there that says, if you execute my smart contract, this is what you're going to get. You're going to get access to the data, but it has a whole bunch of conditions on it. And so when you execute that smart contract, the record of that is also stored permanently in the blockchain. And what I mean by permanently is we can't alter that. So, for years to come, if we were to ever try to alter it, the whole blockchain would break. And then that's hence the name of the blockchain. Each of the transactions are linked to each other in such a way that if you were to try and tamper with the data, it would be evident straight away. And so we have the ability to control, right down to a particular company to say, well, I don't want to sell data to my competitors, or I can say, well, I only want to sell it to those in the market research industry, and also right down to the fields. So some fields of my data are more sensitive than others. So it makes sense that the contracts allow you to specify which fields you want to make available, rather than just saying, well, it's a global sale. It's worth explaining just a little bit about how we link up these records, and we do that with what we call an identity graph. So in our system, we use a graph database. A graphing database is basically a database that, rather than store tables, it stores bytes of data and a relationship between those bytes of data, or those nodes as they're called. And so it has a very fast way of being able to find the relationship between different sets of data. And in this example, you can see on the screen here, it shows that record A and record B might have a relationship or a linkage by the fact that they've got the same first name, last name, and postal address. Record B and D might be linked by the fact that they share an email, D&E, a cell phone, and so forth, and even down to custom fields. So in C and D, the relationship there can be, for example, it might be a live ramp ID, or it might be some brand new field that two suppliers have come up by themselves. A system allows you to link the records by that new ID. And it does, the reason why we use a graph database is because it does this very, very fast. So in a few milliseconds, you can find the relationship between record A and E, and what is the shortest path between those, and how do they relate to each other. Then how do we validate the data is by the fact that that linkage that I just mentioned builds up that confidence score that I mentioned before. So the more linkage, the more confidence score you have. And in a typical way of linking records up, it would be, so you would build a system that would say, okay, I want to link up records if they all share the same email address. A graph database allows you to do something much more complex than that, to say, well, the linkage can be any weird variation that you come up with, or a set of templates that we've got. It doesn't matter how the relationship is, and that's the advantage of a graph. This is just a screenshot of the admin dashboard that we've built within our system right now. So we're in the middle of some beta trials. We've also conducted some over the last couple of months, and we've also did some back in December. And so this is just an example admin dashboard of a data agent, someone who's administering consumer data. And what you see there is on the second row there, the average confidence score. So this says basically there are almost every single record has an exact match. So if it was 1, it would mean that every record has a match with another record from another organization. And so it's used to build up that confidence score to say, how many records is it a match of. These charts down the bottom show you records that change over time. Obviously, there's not a lot of history that's stored in this example, but it's useful to know that how has my confidence score changed over time. I've just loaded in a whole bunch of new records, and has that suddenly reduced my confidence score, my match rate. The system also allows you to show duplicates in your own system. So using that same graphing technology, it's used to tell you how you relate to other records, but it's also to tell you how you relate to your own records. And so you can use the system to remove duplicates that are a little bit more complex than just, are they the same email address? This is an example of once you've selected one of those records. So in the detail tab, you can select a record and show all the relationships that exist on this record. So the blue dots are records, and the orange dots in this are the fields that are attached to those records. And it shows here that the one record that has been selected relates to four other records, and you can drill into each of those and find out, what does that also relate to. So it's a little bit of a tool to show you if you're really looking for a particular individual and find extra data around that individual. This is an advanced tool to allow you to drill into that. And as you can imagine, the graph is huge. So in our system at the moment, we have over 800,000 records that have been placed in. The graph becomes very, very, very large. And obviously, it's not useful to look at it in a way like this, but this is just to visualize how complex these relationships can become. The beta test that we did, there's probably three main parts that we tested. So we wanted to test the speed, the privacy, and the matching. So one of the common complaints around blockchain is that it is very slow. So I often like to explain to people that blockchain is like the slowest database that you can find. It's just a big, slow database. And so there has to be ways that you mitigate that speed. And so we have built in a whole bunch of features to do that. One of them is a caching layer that sits on top of the blockchain. And so, look, we loaded up over 800,000 records. We put them on a very low spec machine inside Amazon, and we only just turned on one node. So the system has the ability to turn on multiple nodes and obviously increase the specs of that machine. And we're able to load almost 1 million records in a couple of hours over the network, so from a remote location. And so that satisfied our need around speed. Obviously, once we go live, we'll turn on more nodes and turn up the actual specs on each machine. It was important to us to make sure that privacy was preserved in our network. We couldn't have any scenario where in any of the log files or in the actual databases we accidentally store PII. And so the APIs that were built will actually reject anything that it thinks is PII. So say, for example, you have created a field, and in that field name, instead of using the word email address, you actually put an email address in there. Then the system will detect that and reject it and complain that you've potentially used an email address or a phone number or other PII. And so none of our records contain any sort of raw data. We didn't want to have our network being seen as one big honeypot of information. We also only store the absolute minimum information we require to identify someone or to create that linkage. We don't actually store the raw fields around their opinions or their other demographics other than just identifiers. And so the information on the individuals will stay where it is right now with the partners. Our role in creating this sort of gateway or this glue is to connect up and show how they relate, but not actually suck in all that data. And the third thing that we have tested is a normalization and matching process. So for those who are familiar with hashing, basically you take a raw string, you put it through a hash algorithm, and out comes a big long string. You cannot search that output to see if it is close to another string. So two strings that have even one character different, if you put them through a hash, they'll look dramatically different. And so it's very important before you use any sort of system that hashes data that it's always in the same format. And now that's really simple for things like emails and and birth dates and other things like that. It's quite complex for addresses. And so we use a third-party address formatting tool, for example, that formats the address in a standard format every single time. And so we ran a number of tests with that. And so one particular database, there's 4 partners who have loaded data into a network, and one of those, there were 6 partners. Of those 6, 2 of them loaded in 2 organizations that related to each other, loaded in around 32,000 records from data sets that were originally somewhat combined but have taken on life of their own over the years. And so, addresses have been changed over time, email addresses, things have been modified because they've been used in dramatically different ways over their lifespan. And so our system was able to normalize and match in almost 100% of the cases, so between those 2 sets. So what we're able to prove there is that our normalization process in fact works. So addresses have been put into the right format and before they've been hashed, and we can get a great combined record. And so that's what we consider is at this stage is a great result. Where we are heading is the second stage of our development, which is the ability to actually catalog now all of their fields that are available and to be able to actually transact them. And so that is a version that's coming before the end of the year and will be available in the year after we run some trials on it.
All right.
So Lenny, do you want to bring this back?
Yep. So let's see. We've got some questions coming in, so we'll dive right into that. So first, thank you Thank you, James. Thank you, Rolf. And actually, before we get into questions, I've got to make one plug for Rolf. Not only is this an exciting day for Veriglif, but Rolf, you personally, you got some cool stuff happening today. Why don't you tell that just for a second, because I think everybody will think it's really cool, too.
Sure. Thanks, Lenny. Yeah, it's, my daughter is, who's 10, has found herself in the leading role of a new show on ABC called Emergence. It premieres tonight at 10 o'clock, and I would really encourage everyone to watch. Obviously, I'm a proud father, but it's been interesting. It's a guy who's been involved in startups. I think what's one of the most incredible things is actually watching how and closely the process of the making the show, and there's like 250 people involved in trying to come up with a really great, engaging, interesting thriller of a story. And if you like a little bit of mystery, a little bit of sci-fi, it's a great show. And as you guys all know, in the crazy world of fragmented television, every eyeball watches. So please tune in, ABC, 10 o'clock tonight, and you'll love the show. I promise.
There you go. So hope everybody appreciates the proud daddy moment there before we dive into anything else. I don't think his daughter is actually the star. Piper, she's the star of the show. Anyway, all right, questions. So Jim is asking, apart from the current fields we are capturing, is Veriglif aiming to add new fields such as records, work profile, title, et cetera, et cetera? James, why don't you talk to that for a second?
Yeah. So look, our system is built to handle any fields that you can put into it. So we have a standard set of schema that we allow to be put in. And that is specifically so that we can normalize it a certain way. But the system, however, will handle any field that you put into it. We expect that our actual partners will store lots and lots of different fields. In our network, however, for the linkage purpose, we only need things that are used to identify. So, addresses, emails, live app IDs, cookie IDs, any form of linkage we'll use. So it's really up to the partner as to what fields they want to put in that they think will be used for linkage. We have some templates on how we link those records up. So we're looking for specific fields. However, you can, in an advanced way, go and say, well, I want to link on this brand new field that I've called, XYZ. And my partner, another partner that I'm working with, also happens to have that same field. Therefore, we're going to link it that way. So it's really up to the partners as to what fields they put in. We don't dictate that. We do have some minimum fields that we require. For example, you do require, at the moment, it's mandatory to put a country in, particularly so that we can ensure that when we're providing you an audit sort of certificate, so to speak, you can see what jurisdiction the records belong to. So there are some things that are mandatory, but yes, it's up to the partner to choose.
Okay. And for what it's worth, we've had conversations with Internet of Things, geolocation, CRM, genetic companies. So,
yes.
Lots of different data sources there. All right. Cedric is asking, would you say the company that is GDPR compliant is ready for CCPA? That is not our understanding, Cedric.
No.
You cannot make that assumption. The CCPA is more restrictive and broader and more general in a variety of ways. So GDPR compliance does not guarantee CCPA compliance, is our understanding.
Yeah, just a further thing to that. This question's been coming up a lot with me and our clients at GFK. Lenny's correct, but this is a short answer. I think it'd be worth us, Lenny, probably doing a follow-up webinar, just really digging into specifically those issues, because as we're all trying to help everyone handle this, it's unfortunately complicated and not totally aligned. I think that generally the principles are enough the same, that it's in the same spirit, but the details are definitely leading people to have to make some different decisions right now as they make sure that the suppliers are compliant or their partners are compliant in different ways.
Ola Sola is asking, do you have any clients at the moment? What pilot program company are you working with? So we actually have I think 16 different, we call them founding members. These are early stage companies that, they're not early stage, they're very mature companies, but they're working with us as we build out from the beta stage, which Veriglif is in right now, to full commercialization, which will be in January. And if you go to veriglif.com, there's you can see all of our partners. We update that regularly, and you also can join as one of the founding partners as well. It's important to make sure that you understand that from our perspective, we don't have clients. We have network partners, and any transactions that occur are amongst the network partners. Our job is to be the connective tissue and to facilitate the compliance layer and the data liquidity layer. But you only engage with the data within the Veriglif network through the partners in the network. There's no one can ever call Veriglif and say, I want to order, a survey of 1,000 people. We don't do that. So you would have to work through the data partners in the network already to do that. So for us, we only focus on developing partnerships with folks that have relationships with consumer data. That's it. And again, we only make money by processing the transactions. We're talking about a few pennies per record to address that. So it's a little different way to think about things. Let's see. Sergio, thank you, saying it's an excellent presentation. And Sergio goes on to talk about I'm from Mexico. Sad to say that since the publication of our local legislation, sanctions have not yet been released, also because there's a black market that's dedicated to selling information to people such as phones, credit card numbers, and plus. However, as a market research agency, we must be very aware of other global laws that can impact our relationship with respondents' customers. And yeah, I mean, I think you're pointing out that there is a black market for data that exists. My wife and I were in the Equifax hack, and our information was sold. People were opening up false accounts in our name all over the place. Now, that's a very specific example, but we experienced it firsthand, which kind of drove me to, as Rolf mentioned, we were talking about these ideas for years. Once that happened to me personally, just with my credit data, it's like, whoa, wait a minute, something's got to change, right? And helped light a fire under me in thinking more about this idea, and that there's a direct chain of events that led to Veriglif. And I think that as these regulations come into play, we'll see a growth of that black market economy, and that's going to be bad for everybody. So the more that we can get ahead of that and create a systems that can limit that, the better off we all are. So we are getting to the top of the hour. I don't see any more questions. I want to appreciate everybody joining. Rolf, do you want to give one final thought? And James, you give a final thought as well as we wrap up?
Yeah, final thought is I appreciate everyone for being on this call. This is dealing with this data. It all shows that all of you are concerned and are forward thinking in how to work with data. And so thanks for committing some time today just to learn more, and feel free to talk to any of us about how to think about this, whether it's very specific with Veriglif or more widely, just on strategies on how to make sure you're really preparing to deal with data in a way that we're going to all need to going forward.
Yep. Thank you, Rolf. James, last word.
Yeah, look, very, very much appreciate everyone's time as well. Like, I think we've had close to 200 participants, so I appreciate everyone taking this seriously. And I think, the overall objective, and probably follow up from Sergio's comment, is there will be some areas where legislation won't be finalised. And I think the overarching respectful thing to do, however, as an industry, is to say, well, is to ask ourselves, would our consumers or would our people or individuals be surprised around how we are using their data? And so if we can say that no, they wouldn't, they are fully aware and they are happy for it to be used that way, then I think that goes a long way to preparing ourselves, at least for every piece of legislation. I think that's the common theme, is about respecting the individual and not surprising them with how it's being used. So yeah, thank you everyone for your time.
All right. Thank you, guys. Thank you, everybody. Be on the lookout for the next webinar very soon, and we'll let you reclaim 1 minute of your day. So
that's great. And watch Emergence, 10 o'clock, please.
And watch Emergence tonight at 10 o'clock. All right, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Take care. Have a great day.
Thank
Bye
you.
now.
Bye-bye.